Great, thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm delighted to be with you today and to introduce you to my colleague Hardy Merriman, who is the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Prior to that, he has spent at least a decade in the field of nonviolent resistance and nonviolent conflict, working with Gene Sharp and then later in his, at the ICNC in various capacities. The topic that Hardy is going to discuss today is one that I think has a lot of room for empirical growth. So for those of you who are here as researchers, I think it's worth noting a few of the key puzzles and unanswered questions that come up in the course of Hardy's talk. And for those of you who are here who work in a more applied or policy capacity, I think you'll see also a lot of areas where policy and practitioner communities can come together and try to solve some of the current challenges in this regard as well. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Hardy for his talk today. And after Hardy speaks for about 30 minutes, Scott will offer some brief discussant remarks, and then I'll turn it to you for question and answer, and I'll just keep the queue tally, and we'll go one by one. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Erica. It's really great to be at Prio, and I especially want to thank Scott Gates for setting this up. For the last 13 years now, I guess, I've been looking at nonviolent movements around the world that are struggling for human rights, freedom, and justice. And I have looked at movements from women's rights, labor rights, minority rights, anti-corruption movements, movements struggling for democracy, movements confronting states, movements confronting corporations, and a wide range of other ways or causes around which ordinary people organize themselves, unite, and mobilize to try to challenge power holders and hold them accountable. And the question I have come back to continually is a very simple one. Why do some movements succeed and why do others fail? And the emphasis that I've had in looking at those questions has been looking at strategy. What kind of choices and strategies work for different kind of movements in different contexts, and what kind of strategies have failed? And what kinds of cross-applicable best practices can be discerned by looking at movements in different time periods, different scales, different causes, to try to really develop from a social science perspective a view towards what works, what doesn't, and the particular contextual factors that can also influence that issue. Now today I'm going to talk not just about civil resistance movements in their local context, I'm also going to talk about the role of external actors. I think it's very important right now for the international community to have a conversation about what their role can or should be in terms of how they interact with, and in some cases might provide various forms of support or assistance to nonviolent movements. Is there in fact a right or even a responsibility for external actors to be able to stand with, in some way, nonviolent movements that are struggling against oppression and trying to get their human rights? I will argue that there is the potential for the development of a new norm or a new doctrine around the idea of a right to assist nonviolent civil resistance movements. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers. It's complex in terms of how a new norm or doctrine will be developed and implemented. But what I want to do today is lay down some key facts, put forward some thoughts on this idea, and generate conversation, and also welcome any of your feedback, ideas, thoughts you may have, criticisms, and so forth. Because again, I think it's a critically important topic, but one that can generate a lot of good and healthy constructive debate about the role of external actors and their limits, both what's legal and permissible as well as what's advisable. So my outline has 5 parts. I want to just start with how civil resistance works, a few slides about that so we're all on the same page, and just give a few examples of different movements from Gandhi in 1930 all the way to the present. Then if I want external actors to think critically about developing a new norm or doctrine, I really have to make the case strongly that civil resistance movements matter. That they're critical, actually, when we think about long-term peace, stability, violence reduction, and democratic sustainability, that you really can't talk about those things anymore without thinking about the role of grassroots civil resistance movements. So I'm going to have 4 points about why civil resistance really matters to everyone, even if there's not an active movement in your country. Then I want to talk about the backlash against civil resistance movements, or against civil society, or against democracy promotion. People call it different things. I make distinctions, obviously, between those three things, and I really call it a backlash against civil resistance because I feel like what we've been seeing increasingly among authoritarian governments and trying to repress civic space and organizing is actually a direct result of authoritarians taking note of the power of civil resistance movements, which have been increasing in the last few decades, and studying them and trying to discern best practices and mutual aid to make sure that they prevent movements from rising and repress them when they do. Erica's got really interesting research. From 2010 to 2013, there were more civil resistance movements in Erica's data set, which we can get into the parameters later of that, than in the entire decade of the 1990s. So the incidence is dramatically increasing. The success rate has gone up and up and up from about 1950 into 2000, 2010, and has started to decline. In addition, the amount of movements now being confronted with lethal force has increased. And so there's some really interesting, shifting, troubling trends that we're not quite sure right now. Is this reversion to the mean, or is this, the development of a new trend? I do think that the backlash against civil resistance, and we'll get into some of the particulars of how that looks in different places, is a clear factor in the declining success rate of civil resistance movements. That said, civil resistance movements are still, I would argue, one of the most effective, if not the most effective, means for ensuring human rights and long-term democratic stability. So, next question. Well, if authoritarian governments and some non-state actors have taken note of the power of civil resistance movements and are actively trying to repress those movements and really understand those movements, what about those who have sympathies with those movements that are struggling for human rights and democracy? What can or should their role be? Do they even really understand movements as well as, for example, those who are trying to repress them? I would argue, by and large, the international community of INGOs, members of multilateral institutions, states, and others who would be concerned potentially with the causes that movements are supporting have not had as coherent a response nearly as the authoritarian side. And there's confusion both about the legal limits of what they can do, the legal the advisability of what they can do, and even understanding, again, and part of what I'll get to in this presentation, how movements create change. Because I think it's important for people to understand the whole sort of model of change around grassroots movements in order to understand how do we potentially engage with them. Now, one of the main ways that authoritarian regimes and others try to delegitimize movements is by saying they're foreign-backed. These are foreign agents. And no one has ever given me any kind of compelling argument or proof for why millions of people in Ukraine or Egypt or any of the other places where we've seen civil resistance movements, why these people are somehow all controlled by some outside external actor. I find the claim ridiculous on its face. External actors, of course, try to influence movements. Do they control them? Absolutely not. Civil resistance is not an exported phenomenon or an imported phenomenon. And I think in my research of civil resistance movements, they are driven by local decisions, local people, and that is as it should be. External actors do not have a primary role to play in trying to create movements or advise movements or control movements. That said, I think international actors do have a role to play in listening to movements, engaging with different actors and listening to their needs, trying to figure out if there are ways of support which could be indirect, for example, the imposition of sanctions or pressure on a state to try to reduce repression or change behavior, or things as simple as sharing information, sharing contacts, being witnesses to demonstrations so that if repression happens, there are foreign observers. Simple things that external actors can do from different external sectors, INGO, state, multilateral, and so forth, that can be quite helpful. Movements are not externally driven, but that doesn't mean that external actors can't play some sort of constructive role in supporting them when they're responding to local needs. And then the last slide that I have for this presentation is If we're serious about developing a doctrine or norm around a right to assist, what are some of the issues that puts on the table for us? And I'll sort of close with that. Now, when I do a presentation, I always put more slides in than I have time for. So I actually have 90 slides, complete with like, if anyone asks about different forms of external support or guidelines or thoughts, I have slides for that. But I certainly don't want to try to compress 5 hours worth of stuff in an hour and 45-minute presentation. So please let your questions run wild or your comments later. So how civil resistance works. So civil resistance is based on the core idea that power in society comes from the consent and obedience of thousands or millions of ordinary people in society. That basically, if ordinary people have thousands or millions of sort of micro-obedience patterns every day. They obey traffic laws, they go to work on time, they go to school, they do their homework, they pay their taxes or they don't pay their taxes, they pay their utility bills, they invest their money in certain ways, they buy certain products, they obey certain social conventions or cultural conventions, observe certain holidays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that obedience and consent is not necessarily ongoing. Mechanics can stop repairing things, engineers can stop designing bridges, builders can stop building, mechanics can stop repairing, women can stop, or men can stop, going to work or start changing the way in which they raise their children. Children can stop going to school. Bankers can stop banking, or people can stop putting their money in banks. People can shift their buying patterns, and so on and so forth. And that when thousands or millions of ordinary people start to shift their consent and obedience patterns in strategic, systematic, and targeted ways, they can actually create quite a bit of leverage in those situations. And this sounds like a nice idea, and it did to me too when I first heard it, but it's actually a remarkably practical idea too. As Gene Sharp started to, and others have shown academically, as well as numerous case studies from Gandhi and further back, people actually operationalize this idea, and movements are able to unify, organize, mobilize, and target shifts in obedience in ways that actually can really shift oppressive behavior patterns and power dynamics in society. So when movements do that, they exert economic, political, and social pressure through a wide array of tactics: strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, and lots of other tactics that really we can't take a picture of. Small, simple things like shifting obedience patterns, refusing to pay bills, so forth. You can't take a picture of it. It doesn't make the front pages, but all these acts can be incredibly powerful when they're done by a movement in an organized way. So movements weaken authoritarian regimes, or, for example, if they're attempting to hold corporations or non-state entities accountable, it's not always dissimilar, but I'll use authoritarian regimes to keep it a simple example here. By number one, reducing their legitimacy. Authoritarian regimes obviously depend on control of information streams as a way to try to frame and create reference points for people about why the authoritarian is good and in charge. And civil resistance movements disturb the peace. They call out the lie. These are terms that Václav Havel uses to describe part of what he was trying to do in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. They create other reference points. They break through sort of the propaganda or the media that has excluded certain views or prevented certain analyses. They also reduce legitimacy by showing that authoritarians cannot control everything all the time. One of the premises of authoritarian control is often, well, we create stability. We can control everything. And when movements reveal that that in fact is not true, that authoritarian power is actually somewhat fragile, this also reduces legitimacy. When legitimacy is reduced, at the same time, this can lead to reductions in capacities. Material resources, taxes, or products that people buy that benefit regime functionaries, people can choose to shift their money away from that. When people go on strike, they deny their labor. When people boycott, they deny their dollars or their various other forms of boycotts. And so this actually ultimately reduces capacities. If trains don't run and truckers don't truck, things don't ship. If buses don't run, people don't move. And so these are very real ways in which the capacities, which are often looked at as a fixed structure in a conflict, can actually shift over the course of a conflict when people start disobeying. The last point I'd make briefly is simply that movements can also create defections. And they can do this in a number of ways. For example, we have seen in many cases of civil resistance where you'll find members of the bureaucracy, members of the military and police forces, state-run media, judiciary, and so forth that start to shift, or corporations. And some may shift out of self-interest. Corporations may find that, in fact, it's no longer profitable to do business in a regime that is so oppressive, and start to feel that perhaps their bottom line is more important than propping up a corrupt elite, and start to shift under the pressure of a movement. Other people may shift because they truly believe something else is possible, and the movement has shown that another way is possible. Some people shift because their families join movements, and they start thinking, my kids are in this crowd, perhaps I should start thinking differently about what I'm confronting. Whatever the reason, defections are widely documented sort of effect of civil resistance movements. Now, movements also strengthen populations in a few ways. They instill hope in a population by demonstrating that ordinary people have the power and that change is possible. A lot of people, fear, of course, is one reason why people may not do anything. But another reason people may not do anything to challenge a status quo is because they feel hopeless about it. People aren't necessarily afraid to take risks, but they really don't want to take risks if they feel that it's going to be futile and useless. And so movements start demonstrating that change is possible, first in small things, and as people watch and see that change is possible in small things, that demonstration effect is very powerful and starts to shift the psychology around perhaps our shifting consent will create a form of power for us, and perhaps we can use that to change larger things. They unify and mobilize a population. Obviously, it's divide and rule is a classic tool of oppression, and movements often have to bridge social distance between people of different genders, ethnicities, social classes, urban-rural divides, and so forth to unify people. And they build alternative institutions and decentralize power in society, critically important in terms of creating sustainable democratic outcomes. And because movements are very participatory, lots of people can be involved, young and old, men and women, urban, rural, and so forth. They create lots of participation in society from different sectors. Many people who didn't think of themselves as terribly political before become politically involved. And this starts to decentralize power, again, which tends to bode well for democratic transitions. So examples, just quickly, we can look at Gandhi. My country, the United States, has a great history of nonviolent movements. This is a women's suffrage movement in 1920. It actually was like a 50-year movement that got women the right to vote in the United States. U.S. labor movement. And it's funny, when I learned U.S. history, I didn't learn about these movements as key contributors to things that make the United States, that have made my life better. This was not part of how I learned U.S. history. But U.S. has a great history of movements. It's just not often told. Civil rights movement we know about. Other movements, the anti-apartheid movement, particularly during the phase of the 1980s, lots of mass nonviolent resistance as part of the United Democratic Front. Solidarność in Poland. This here is a demonstration in Bolivia against the US corporation Bechtel, which privatized, the government allowed Bechtel to privatize water in Cochabamba, the second largest city of Bolivia, so that it was even illegal for Bolivians to harvest their own rainwater, because even before it hit the ground, Bechtel owned it. And Bolivians organized and changed that. This is anti-corruption movement in Korea. These people are all holding red cards, like as if they're at a football match, and they're yelling out the names of corrupt politicians. And every time they yell it, people throw up the red card and say, "Out!" And this was an incredibly successful movement, actually, detailed in this book, which I'll talk later about, Curtailing Corruption. Serbia, the Otpor movement. Pakistan, the Lawyers movement against US-backed military dictatorship of Pervez Musharraf. Burma, the Saffron Revolution. Egypt, 2011. This is obviously like, I'm skipping hundreds of movements, just to throw a few different highlights from different parts of the world. But you get the point. And obviously not all have, some have been effective, as Egypt was, in terms of challenging an authoritarian, but not necessarily getting a democratic consolidation. Others failed to successfully change the authoritarian at the time, but may have had other effects that led to constructive changes later on, and so forth. But quite a few have succeeded. So why should external actors care about this? If there's a civil resistance movement in a given country, and I'm not from that country, and it doesn't seem geostrategically important to me or whatever, why should I care? Well, there are a few reasons. Number one, civil resistance movements are a major force in ending oppressive rule. And so we have here the great work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In their work, looking at 323 cases of violent and nonviolent campaigns over about 100 years, 1900 to 2006, confronting major regimes, trying to get major goals, either the end of foreign occupation, self-determination, or the end of a dictatorship. They found a 53% success rate for civil resistance, nonviolent challenges of regimes, versus 26% for violence. So it's much more effective than most people think at ending oppressive rule. And here you see a chart with blue being success rate, blue being civil resistance, red being violence, and there you see the different success rates for Erica's data set. And one interesting question we can talk about is how this data set goes to, again, 2006, and how things have changed in the last 10 years somewhat. We can get into that in Q&A. And here is by decade. Blue is, you see the increasing impact of civil resistance. Actually, this bar goes up beyond the caption there at the top. I think it's close to 70%, this blue bar. Number two, not only are they very effective at challenging oppressive rule, but they're remarkable at yielding democratic consolidation. When we consider how challenging it is to transition from dictatorship to democracy, because when a transition happens, there's frequently a state that is not ready for free elections, doesn't have free media, doesn't have laws on the books that can change things. They can quickly be changed necessarily, may have endemic corruption issues, and so forth. Democratic change and consolidation is always challenging, incredibly challenging, and yet civil resistance movements, in spite of that, have had a remarkable impact. So looking at, again, Erica's data from the NAVCO data set, we look at 5 years after a successful civil resistance campaign, and we see a 57% success rate of democratic consolidation versus 6% success rate of democratic consolidation for violent campaigns. So we're looking at about a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of effectiveness of sustaining a democratic change. What's interesting as well is look at failed campaigns. Here, failed civil resistance campaigns, 5 years after they failed, still result in a 35% chance of a democratic outcome in 5 years. So they don't just necessarily create an immediate transition, they create collateral effects. They decentralize power that can create democratic development later on. There's another study as well that came out before Erica did her research, which was put out by the organization Freedom House. My organization, ICNC, also worked on this study. And it looked at 67 transitions from authoritarian governments from 1970 to 2005. And I won't go through all the statistics. It's a free study. You can download it online. But just briefly, they found that 75% of the transitions that they studied, they determined nonviolent civic resistance, as they termed it, was a, quote, key factor driving those transitions. And they also found that transitions that were led by nonviolent civic resistance had the greatest democratic gains of any other means. So what other means did they look at? They looked at top-down transitions. They looked at transitions where elites got together perhaps for a peace accord or just decided they wanted to change things without significant grassroots pressure. And they looked at how those transitions did, and they found, what was it, a 14% success rate? Oh, 3 were free, so 21% success rate for top-down driven transitions. And then interestingly, they looked at, well, what happens when there's only regime violence but no violence by the civil resistance movement? And they still found a 60% democratic outcome. But when the civil resistance movement starts engaging in violence, the democratic outcome drops to 20%. So it's not the incidence of violence that is key determinant, it's the opposition, is the movement engaging in violence that really drops the percentage of a democratic outcome. And here is a chart to show this. So blue is transitions driven by civil resistance. Red is driven by elites and top-down initiatives. And then whatever this is, yellow-green, is driven by civil resistance mixed with violence. And you can see the outcomes: free, partly free, not free, in terms of the states in which those transitions happened. I think I'm actually going to skip this slide for now and go to the next one. There's another critical factor here that I think is emerging, and actually for those of you who are doing research, I would love to see more research on this topic. I would argue that civil resistance are really powerful at starting to curb corruption and making progress against corruption. That bottom-up civil resistance-driven initiatives can do remarkable things to try to correct corruption that top-down initiatives alone cannot address. And so it's been increasingly evident over the last 5-10 years that civilian-based efforts are critical in dealing with corruption. So in the International Anti-Corruption Conference in 2010, one of their closing statements, sort of in this final summary, was empowered people create change. This expanded element of our conference points the way for the future of the anti-corruption movement, one incorporating citizen mobilization and empowerment, as well as the inclusion of youth. So the broader corruption community, as represented in that conference, in 2010 is laying down a marker saying this is the future, is trying to get civilians engaged in this. By the next time, 2012, their entire conference was called Mobilizing People, Connecting Agents of Change, seeing again that top-down initiatives alone cannot curb corruption. We see in Transparency International's Strategy 2015 plan, which had 6 points, one of the key points was increased empowerment of people and partners around the world to take action against corruption. The challenge is to engage with people more widely than ever before, for ultimately only people can stop corruption. We even see at the World Bank making statements recognizing that people have to be active agents of change in addressing corruption in their countries. And there's a great book, which I'm going to plug for a second, by my colleague Shaska Byerly that, again, my organization supported. She looked at 16 campaigns, nonviolent campaigns, addressing corruption around the world. Everything from that campaign in Korea that I mentioned to you a second ago, to what Sicilians have done to try to take on the mafia and actually successfully curb the mafia. So corruption by non-state actors and state actors. It's a remarkable set of case studies. She ultimately, I think 12 made it into this book of the 16 that she researched. And I think there's a lot more good work that can be done about it. And her point isn't that it's just bottom up. It's bottom up and top down is much more effective when you have bottom up pressure as well. And then lastly, if you look at overturning oppression, if you look at democratic development and consolidation, and if you look at curbing corruption, what you're really looking at is a force that has the potential to lead to long-term democratic stability, peace, and reduction of violence, because it can reduce some of the core drivers of instability and violence. So it can reduce conditions that lead to inter and interstate wars, reduce potential for humanitarian public health crises, increase long-term peace and stability. I'm not a great artist, as you can see, but here's my sort of network of interlinking root causes, and I would argue not that civil resistance is the answer, but it's a critical part of the answer to dealing with a lot of these interlinked root causes that are very challenging to transform. So that's my pitch, part of my pitch about why movements really matter and why they have very long-term implications that I think all actors concerned with the world, the state of the world, and creating a world that's better for people really need to pay attention to. Now let's talk about the backlash for a second. It's fairly well known what some of the sort of aspects of the backlash are, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but only to sort of say there are very active efforts being taken to limit and shape civil society and various authoritarian regimes, as we know, everything from funding restrictions to registration restrictions to shutting them down, kicking them out of the country, claiming that if they take even $1 from external sources that they're foreign agents and so forth. But it's not even so much the funding restrictions that I'm concerned with, it's really a lot of the other stuff and just simple repression. Tight management of electoral processes, labeling civil society and any dissent as externally backed foreign agents. This is one of the key things that any external group that might engage with the movement has to think about, is whether it plays into that narrative. On the other hand, many movements that have not been externally backed at all have still been labeled foreign agents because regimes do it anyway, no matter what. So that's also true. Advocating a discourse of hyper-sovereignty, we'll get into that later. Basically, the authoritarian argument that anything anything that external actors want to do, stop at my borders. And sort of corollary to that, some of those who argue most aggressively that they have total sovereignty and can stop anything at their borders have no problem with their governments getting all kinds of corporate assistance and assistance from other governments. They have no problem with their business community getting all kinds of external foreign investment and everything else. But when civil society gets any kind of contact at all, oh no, we can't let that happen. So there's already quite a double standard there with how they look at those things. Sharing best practices with other authoritarian regimes, I think this is going on quite a bit. Through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one example where there have been sort of indications that has happened as well as probably informally among a lot of other regimes. Providing political, economic, military, and technical support to regimes, confronting nonviolent challenges. You see it in votes in the UN. You see it in making emergency loans when movements are challenging the economy of a particular regime, or certainly in lending security advice or actually security personnel. Controlling information streams, both trying to keep information out that might be useful to grassroots actors, as well as more broadly simply constricting free flow of information. Labeling nonviolent resistance as terrorism, which this isn't even just something that authoritarian governments do. Some democratic governments don't have it on the books, is my understanding, that terrorism is by definition violent. There's a little hole in the definition of terrorism that might even allow nonviolent acts to be conceived of as terrorist, which is worrying and troublesome. Sharing information and monitoring technology, and direct military intervention, as we've seen in Ukraine and with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So these are some elements of the backlash, and it keeps continuing. I mean, authoritarians aren't resting on their laurels. They're actively continuing to find new ways. I'll give you an example. There are now anti-Maidan groups, my understanding is what I've heard, is there are anti-Maidan groups in Russia, groups of ordinary citizens that are being sort of cultivated by the government to specifically try to counter any kind of nonviolent protest that happens. So while this represents part of the playbook keeps changing and progressing. And again, the question is, for those who are sympathetic to movements, if this is the status quo, what can external actors do to have a more sort of clear approach to pushing back against some of this? Because really, when you boil it down, the two core principles around which a lot of this authoritarian backlash is wrapped, that they wrap around, this sort of two core principles, is what I call NR2NR, no right to nonviolent resistance. And then NR2A, no right to assist. And although these norms haven't been articulated like that, they're not norms, but I believe that there is a concerted effort to try to create these as international norms through repeating them so much, through practice, that functionally people start to believe civil resistance, well, that's not necessarily protected by international human rights law, and we as external actors, we can't really do anything about it. These are sort of de facto norms that are being pushed consistently. And this is why I think it's so critical for the international community to start to answer these and say, wait a minute. So is there a right or responsibility to assist? Well, we certainly know that through international treaties there are rights of assembly, association, conscience, expression, and various political participation rights that are guaranteed under widely recognized treaties. We know that there are UN General Assembly resolutions that reaffirm these rights. We know that there are international institutions that are supposed to monitor these treaties that also issue statements that have some legal power reasserting this. And I'll just give you a few quotes. This is a quote from Mina Kiai, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The right to freedom of association not only includes the ability of individuals or legal entities to form and join an association, but also to seek, receive, and use resources, human, material, and financial, from domestic, foreign, and international sources. So I don't just have a right to associate with you, you have a right to associate with me. The right of association means nothing if I can associate with anyone, but no one has the right to associate with me. Here is some commentary from legal scholar Elizabeth Wilson, who recently wrote a really interesting chapter in, let's see if I have it, this book. Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback? And Elizabeth Wilson started to think through what some of the legal case would be for A, why civil resistance is protected under international law, and why certain forms of assistance in certain contexts is also arguably protected by international law. So she starts to lay out the case in a chapter in this book, and here are some quotes. The primary right to engage in nonviolent protest implicates political participation rights, the rights to opinion, information, and expression, the rights of peaceful assembly and association. So these rights receive expression and to some extent are enforced by nonviolent actors on the ground. The right to receive information is transitive, meaning it goes both ways with respect to the right to impart information. If I can receive information, you have a right to impart it to me. The right to associate with those willing to provide support is transitive, goes both ways with the right to associate with those who wish to receive support. Nonviolent actors are protected by the right of self-determination, the right of peaceful assembly, and various political participation rights. And I am not a legal scholar, and I hope some of you are and can provide some incisive commentary. But even if not, I think this is also a legal argument that needs to be had further. I'm not saying it's a clear-cut case necessarily, but there are certainly points to push up against this no right to civil resistance, no right to assist case that is being made that I would argue has far fewer legal bases. And so Elizabeth Wilson here talks about various political participation rights, such as in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, all people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Civil resistance could be seen as an expression of that right or as guaranteeing that right. Article 25, every citizen shall have the right and opportunity to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives, and to vote and be elected to a genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and so on and so forth. And so again, you can see civil resistance less necessarily, in this case, less as a pure expression of those rights, but more as a guarantor of those rights. Now, what about the counter-arguments, the norm of non-intervention? What about violations of sovereignty? Those are legitimate concerns. But they're certainly not the sort of case closed, end of conversation kind of concerns that a lot of authoritarian states would have you believe. So non-intervention was codified in the UN Charter as prohibiting the threat or use of force against another member state. So it doesn't, at least in the UN Charter, to my understanding, outlaw nonviolent forms, for example, information exchange. There are other places where the idea of non-intervention is more broadly construed. So the question is what forms of intervention, obviously, are legitimate or not legitimate, but at least in terms of how it was enshrined in the UN Charter, it was about violence. And the reason for non-intervention is because, and this is repeated again and again and again, people have a right to self-determination. They have a right to determine the way that they will develop in their state. Now here's the question. If people are being oppressed, repressed, not allowed to have any representation, there are dictators for life, elections are rigged, how are people free to actually exercise their right of self-determination? They're not. And if they're not, then it can be argued that actually assistance to those people to exercise that right of self-determination is actually legitimate. It's in direct keeping with support for self-determination, that people should find the means to determine their way when domestically they're prevented from doing so. Another point is that sovereignty resides in a population, not necessarily the head of state. So the state is the population of the state. The government is a particular head of state. And if that head of state doesn't claim or doesn't get the ability to claim sovereignty through periodic elections or other processes that show that they represent the will of the people, should they be allowed actually then to assert sovereignty as the legitimate representative of the people? And then, of course, international human rights law, and we talked about this, and treaties make sovereign assertions flexible. So assertions of hyper-sovereignty, if we really take those to the limit, that makes a lot of human rights law pretty obsolete, doesn't it? Because you really can't do anything to enforce it if it goes over a border. And we know that that's not the case. We know that actually, some have argued that actually as a regime becomes more violent against nonviolent challenges, that can trigger escalating levels of intervention and make sovereignty less and less and less of a powerful argument against it. And then, of course, there are contradictions in practice. Some of the states that are most concerned about sovereignty are the ones that regularly violate the sovereignty of other countries through military invasion or other affairs. And one of the bases of international law is not just treaties, it's customary international law, which basically means established through practice. So if we look at practice, I mean, there are all kinds of contradictions in terms of what the law says about what sovereignty says can and can't be done and what states are actually doing. So considerations in developing a right to assist. This is a very sort of challenging topic to think about with regards to how a doctrine could be developed. There are a lot of issues that come forth. And again, I simply want to put it forward for conversation and welcome ideas, thoughts, and feedback that you might have, because I don't have the full case here. I just think it's a conversation we need to engage in. So here are some big issues that I see. So what forms of assistance would be permissible under what circumstances? Who would provide various forms of assistance? Who could receive various forms of assistance? Is it a right to assist or a responsibility to assist? We have, of course, the idea of responsibility to protect, which binds states to do certain things. Of course, it's fairly different from what I'm proposing in R2A in terms of when it would be triggered and certainly in terms of the kinds of action it would trigger. So that's sort of where the similarities end, is just in the name. But is it a right or responsibility to assist? Would R2A be formally invoked? Is this something that actually, is there a body in which this gets formally provoked, or is it sort of a norm that starts to get cited and established through precedent? Would new institutions need to be created to operationalize R2A? And what would be the process of establishing it? And then furthermore, I guess another point would simply be, even once it's clarified what the law would allow, what's really advisable? And this is a critical question, because I do think there are so many ways that external support can be done that is damaging. For a long time, this is actually a topic that I didn't really want to talk about much, because I was much more interested intellectually and also felt it was much more appropriate to put all my emphasis on the role of ordinary people in their society challenging oppression, because they are the drivers of movements. And that is where a lot of the focus should be. But in light of what I've seen in terms of this extreme backlash, again, this is the conversation that's time has come. There are a lot of ways in which external support can be done poorly, but there are some simple things that external supporters can do when they listen and engage and try to discern local needs that might be helpful. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Scott, over to you.
Well, I never saw this. There's no paper. I've not seen the presentation, so these are very much off-the-cuff comments. They're just my thoughts that occurred as Hardy was talking. So I'll keep my comments brief, and that will allow more time for comments and questions from the audience. But I have a couple points that I want to underscore. First of all, I want to say thank you for a really enlightening and interesting presentation. I think the whole question of R2A, the right to assist, is something that has very, very broad implications, and they reach much further than orientation towards nonviolent action, but are extraordinarily relevant to that. What I want to do, though, is I want to back up and put a frame to what this presentation is about, and what R2A is all about, and what nonviolent movements are about. Now, what's nice about the presentation is that Hardy starts with the logic of what nonviolent movements are all about the problem of collective action and getting the groups together, getting people on the street, the need for large numbers, huge numbers of people become critical to the success of these movements. So the problem of getting around a fundamental collective action problem is incredibly important. Normally, especially if there's any threat to my physical being, the discomfort of being out on a protest, potentially life-threatening environment, these are going to be very difficult. And they're ones in which the more people that are out in the street, the easier it is for me to join. The fewer the people, the more risk and the greater the costs that I will bear as an individual. So there's millions of people out there. It's not that much of a difference for me to go out or not. But if there's 10, then it's a huge difference. Now, I underscore that because what I want to get to is a fundamental aspect of all of the logic here is one of a grassroots orientation. And it's one in which individuals are making a decision to participate or to not participate in the movement. Do you go out in the street or don't you? Now that mindset of the individual and the grassroots, or what Hardy refers to as bottom up, is the essence of what he's referring to. Now that creates a very interesting way of thinking about R2A, how to assist a grassroots movement. Normally, when you're looking at this and we think about assistance in external environments, we think of two major types of actors. We think of official international organizations like the ones that he refers to, the World Bank, UN, these types of international organizations which have a very strong, they're international governmental organizations. Representation is by governments. The other is states themselves, nation states provide support. The essence of both of those actors interacting is not bottoms-up logic. That's elite-driven logic. So one thing to think about, and this is a way to move in our thinking, is what do we mean by who's the actor involved in A? Because the recipient, given all the logic, is on the ground. That's a grassroots. But who's representing those people? What's going on the ground is another thing. But we need to think about that. Now, what it leads me to think about is often the organizations on the ground are led by non-governmental actors of various stripes. And it seems to me that continuing the logic, it's NGO to NGO that creates a more natural environment for R2A environments to thrive, because we have a natural bottom-up orientation to it. Now, given that, then there are some questions to be asked too, though. Who are grassroots? What constitutes grassroots? So I'm just going to throw out a few questions that I don't have an answer to. But what constitutes grassroots? What is grassroots? What's bottom up? It's easy to say what it's not, but it's much easier to define what's not than what is. In other words, I know when something is being driven by the government itself, or it's driven by external actors, as the claim is on the backlash. Those things are easy to identify, but where is exactly the ideal frame for grassroots movement, bottoms-up politics? And the logic depends on that really being the essence, that it's going down to individuals making a decision to participate or not. So that in that framing, I think, is very important, and it helps us frame where we are. I don't think it excludes, though, international organizations facilitating the ability of NGOs to engage with other NGOs. It doesn't prevent a nation state from doing that. And maybe that's more of the particular role that a non-bottom-up kind of logic would be, facilitating those activities rather than that. So that's point number one I wanted to make. Number two is, and this is more of a broader question, and that is, if we think about bottom-up grassroots politics, the essence of what it means to have a nonviolent movement succeed, it's depending on this thing called civil society and the development of civil society. And all of us have some feel for what civil society is, But again, what's civil society and what's not civil society is hard to identify, and it would be very, very useful for us to be able to better identify what that means and what's elite and what's grassroots. And I think a lot of times these things are going to be, there are counter elites and there are elites, and counter elites will find it in their interest to say that they're grassroots, but where is that boundary, and does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. The other question when we ask about civil society and the development of civil society, can an outside agent do anything anyway? Is this more of a natural process that has to occur in an indigenous environment? When we think about development, is really the development of the connectivity, the ways that people organize themselves, the way that they engage with one another. Those, to me, don't seem like me sitting in Norway that I can point my finger at some country and say, now you guys should get together and really form a more developed civil society. That doesn't seem, it seems preposterous in many ways. So to what degree can an outsider have any influence in the broader way of explaining development of civil society? Now, the third point has to do with what I regard as a fundamental reason for why nonviolent movements succeed. And that is, they succeed because of all those mass demonstrations, but ultimately, what's really important, and you had a point number 3, and it's divide the regime. And more particularly, you get the security apparatus to not fall in line. That you have some, what Erica refers to as defections within the security apparatus. Now here's where your backlash comes in, and that is, to what degree, by engaging in R2A, do you make it more difficult for an agent of the security apparatus to defect? And so that the framing by the regime becomes critical. And so I think that there is an aspect of any individual organization, and I'm going to use that word to keep with a bottom orientation, is to think through what are the implications. One can never know, but to what degree am I going to create an alienating environment where it would create more problems than good, and that ultimately it may be that an indigenous movement is going to be better off than me engaging at all.
First, do no harm.
Precisely. So that you may actually create an environment that you create a solidification of the security apparatus. You never get the defection, and then your chances of succeeding collapse, really. So I'll leave it with that kind of fundamental workability kind of point. And I think I'll let Erica decide how you want to do it, if you want to gather questions, or if you want Hardy to
talk. A couple comments, just based on what you said, Scott. Thank you for that feedback and commentary. In terms of recipient organizations and what is they're not always organizations. They're groups, not always formally incorporated. In terms of recipients, I don't have an exact definition of what constitutes grassroots or bottom-up. But I do think there are a few clear markers when you're talking about, if there's going to be some form of intervention under international human rights law. Number one, I think, or under some concept of R2A, number one, you would want the recipients to also, in their mission, in their conduct, abide by human rights themselves. Be inclusive, be popular, sort of exercise, in their exercise of human rights, protect the human rights of others. So I think that's key. Another would be, obviously, be committed to nonviolent means themselves. It goes in conjunction with it. And I think those are obviously two key criteria. And I think also in terms of us trying to figure out how best one might intervene, I think it's critical for external actors to think about a diversity of opinions and views in civil society, and not necessarily try to pick winners and pick, oh, these are the groups we're getting behind. That kind of stuff can become divisive very, very fast. In terms of the kinds of roles that external actors can play, I think funding can be very problematic funding can divide a movement. People can get into fights over who's profiting this and that. It can lend a lot of credibility to regime propaganda. And frankly, I don't think it's that important often, because civil resistance is not a like capital intensive enterprise. Movements don't fail because they don't get funded. That's not why they fail. They can fail for lack of strategy, lack of unity, lack of vision, other things, but I don't think funding is really the thing. And this is where movements differ from organizations, because organizations have budgets and paid staff and they need a certain level of funding. Movements, I'm talking about things like, for example, helping activists meet with other activists, like promoting peer interaction. For example, one of my friends and colleagues, Ivan Marovic, who was one of the founders of Otpor, met with other activists in the late 1990s from Slovakia, and he said that was incredibly helpful information just to get from them. And so if third parties can play the role of conveners of trying to get peer exchange, that can be useful. I think a lot of things that movements do, that third parties can do, are actually of indirect support rather than direct support. When they get into this is the movement we're behind, I think the kind of risks that Scott identified skyrocket. But if they can create enabling environments, information exchange, my NGO, we promote research, translate it, and share it with people. That's not because we're getting behind any movement. We're saying this information should be universally accessible. It's up to people what they want to do with it. So those kinds of roles, though, I think can be helpful. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. So we'll turn to the audience now, and if you'll just hold your hand up, I'll acknowledge you, and we'll start with questions. And please introduce yourselves when you do. You first, sir.
Hello, my name is Audun Herning. I'm from NPA, Norwegian People's Aid. Just short, that's the Norwegian labor movement's international solidarity movement. So our first mission was solidarity in Spain in '36, and we've been going on since then. My question is, it's first of all very interesting. Well, President also read some of your work earlier. I think it's very interesting when you talk about civil resistance movements. But my question is also a little bit before we get to that point of actually creating a resistance movement. Because these movements, they don't spring out of nowhere. They come out of organizations. They come out of all the local groups, all the local work, all the places where organizers train, organize, mobilize, and well, learn the craft, or also just gather strength. And these organizations are, I would say, even more prone to hijacking by well-meaning international organizations, UN system, and everyone else. Mostly also because we see these very strong groups in developing countries, in weak states, and we see here's a perfect vehicle to implement our democracy vision, or women's rights vision, or human rights vision, or whatever. So we take away their opportunity to actually organize people to do change. Mm-hmm. But my question is, when it comes to before we get to the movement phase, mm-hmm. when we start just by the organizing in local groups. My own organization's history as a part of the labor movement has always been a history of support, learning, support both financial, organizational, or in the case of strikes or anywhere else, like political. We always learn from each other, and from my political background, learn a lot from people. I'm 100% sure there's so much learning been done in these organizations in the last 100, 150 years that it could be possible to benefit also organization in developing countries. But what your research say about this balance on the experience of civil society organization and how it's possible to implement in more development settings?
Should we take another question?
Or yeah, I'll take another question. Trond?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. First of all, welcome.
Thanks, Trond.
Good to see you again.
Likewise.
Trond Botman, I'm here as a private individual, not representing anyone at the moment. I'd like to start off where Scott finished, about what sort of assistance to give and who should give it, because I think it's obvious there should be an R2A, a right to assist, not necessarily a responsibility to assist. And I concur with everybody who says that it should rather be, say, civil society to civil society assistance, because that doesn't play into the narrative of foreign agents so much as if foreign states actually assist directly. I'd also like to say that one form of assistance that I think can be particularly effective is the protective presence. That actually people go and be present at actions to protect those who are there, or to protect human rights defenders. Peace Brigades International, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, Palestine and Israel, Nonviolent Peace Force, etc., etc. I agree, much more effective than funding. My question regards a statement that was made in the latest issue of Bistandsaktuelt, a magazine for Norwegian development aid, by the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Göran Kalmyr, from the Progress Party. Because this was exactly about Norwegian assistance to NGOs fighting against international companies in Central America. But his comment was that we cannot or should not in Norway give assistance to organizations that break the law. And this becomes for me hugely problematic, because so much of nonviolent resistance, which is legitimate, actually breaks the law. So if that's going to be the new policy of the Norwegian government, there is a lot that Norwegian NGOs do in terms of assisting NGOs in other countries that would not could not continue. So I'd just be interested in hearing some of your arguments and opinions. How would you counter such an argument? I'm basically countering it, saying we should draw the limit not with breaking the law or not breaking the law. We should draw the line between using violence and not using violence. But what would be your arguments in favor of saying a government has to allow its civil society to assist civil society in other countries, although they break the law, purely using nonviolent means?
Sure. Thank you for those great comments and questions. Let me just go back to a slide. To the first question, in terms of taking the practice of those who have waged movements and trying to take it to, if I heard your question correctly, and correct me if I did, the last part of it, and take it to other contexts. One of the interesting pieces of history that I recently learned through a friend and scholar that I know, Mary King, she did extensive research on the diffusion of knowledge from India to the United States before what we popularly know as the civil rights movement. There were boats going back and forth, bringing black future civil rights activists and current civil rights activists to India for periods of study and going back, and taking this knowledge to the, quote, developed United States world. And I think that's just one example of so many where you can see peer exchange being valuable, and where what I've seen consistently is that movements need unity, planning, and discipline to succeed. And whether that happens in a state that has a very different structure than another state economically or politically, those core fundamentals are pretty constant throughout, whether it's a local campaign or national campaign. And how they're achieved and how people think strategically about those, I think, is also very cross-applicable. One of the things that my organization has done, and I think will increasingly try to do, is also, we don't just look at these movements from a social science perspective and say, okay, let's try to find good research on them or support good research so that research with the purpose of trying to give activists good information. We try to take the insights of activists that we interact with and bring those to academics and the policy community and others and say, listen up, this is what people on the ground are saying. And also, again, to try to get that peer-to-peer. So I definitely don't see this as necessarily a one-way, oh, they need help, let's give them help. Not at all. I do really see it as a mutually enriching interaction from which we can learn a lot. And to Tron's point, very interesting. I agree with you on protective presence. This is exactly the kind of assistance I'm talking about, where it can be incredibly powerful. It can create an enabling environment for people to exercise their rights and not necessarily be labeled as, oh, this government's doing this to try to achieve that. This is an NGO. These are ordinary people risking their lives to be in a conflict zone so that people might be free to be able to exercise their human rights. I think The comment about not being able to give aid to organizations that break the law, of course, well, then the question is whose law? Is it international law or domestic law? Right, and domestic law, as we know, can say anything, right? Anything. And the most absurd laws get passed. And so if that's your only barometer, what does human rights law even mean anymore? What does human rights law even mean anymore? I think what I observe, and again, I'm not an international human rights lawyer, human rights are under attack in a major, fundamental way right now. The whole concept of human rights law and like, does it even trump some absurd local law that might be on the books is a huge issue right now. And the reason why I named these two, quote, norms that are being advanced is because no one's naming them, but this is what's creeping in. The idea that even nonviolent resistance might be terrorism, you might be a foreign agent, you might be this. These are basic human rights that are guaranteed under decades of international law. And they should be protected. And protecting them means that sometimes you have to show solidarity with those who are exercising them. And sometimes it means that even if it breaks a domestic law, you know what? There are higher laws than just the domestic laws, particularly when those domestic laws were put in place by a government that does not get consent through elections to represent its people. So anyway, I don't want to get on like a stump and start shouting or anything, but human rights are under attack. No one's going to say, those who are attacking it don't say that directly. They say, we're very reasonable. We just want more sovereignty, non-intervention, this and that. No, those people, you can't trust them. Look, they're disrupting things. Václav Havel consistently referred to disturbing the peace, but disturbing the peace nonviolently because the peace he was living in was a dead peace. It was a peace where people didn't have rights. It was a stability in which people couldn't exercise their own development. And through creating a disruption to that stability, he ultimately, not him personally, Czech society created a much more sustainable long-term stability in which people did have more rights. And that's how I see nonviolent movements. They do create disruption. They do create, quote, instability in the short term, but often, and not always, create longer-term stability if we look at the trends. That said, there are cases in which democratic consolidation doesn't occur. There's a risk of civil war, as we've seen in recent years. These are extremely high stakes, and arguably trying to prevent the slide into civil war is actually another role that external actors can play that could be constructive. As the one opinion I do have, I don't give advice, is to really, really drive home the benefits of remaining nonviolent when people are considering, well, maybe we should start going down a violent path, and saying, look at the literature, look at the case accounts of what's happened when that happens.
The woman in the back.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. You didn't say very much about the actors who would or might be involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to say that there are actually quite a few actors. And the major actors who've been involved, certainly not the international community or the international community in the form of the UN, because the UN consists of exactly those countries that you think are breaking the law, rightly so, as well as others. So the usual suspects in terms of helping are the small European countries and Canada, and they are the countries that have no concerns about breaking laws that people would consider legal. They're very concerned about implementing international human rights. And as you were saying, there's one law, and that is you do not support violent groups. Now that was very difficult, for example, in Africa, both the SWAPO and ANC, which were strongly supported, but they had, for that reason, two wings of their organizations. One was the armed one, and one was the non-armed. And the non-armed was the one that was being supported. But for example, if you go to the ministry, either in Stockholm or in Oslo, you will find programs for female human rights supporters. You will find a great many programs that are not exactly popular in the countries where they're implemented, but they're actually quite important. So I think you should not underestimate that states that consider themselves to be defenders of human rights can be legitimate and very important in precisely the kind of activities that you say NGOs. Now it's true that there are of course also many important NGOs, and this young man was talking about Folkehjälpen, but I think that almost every large Scandinavian NGO engages also on the side in those kinds of activities that you are talking about, and they are usually the best informants also for our own governments as to what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
My name is Musa. I'm coming from the Burundian diaspora. I just have two questions and two ideas to what you just said. You say that sometimes it's believed that the external forces can shape or control movement, which you think that is totally biased. But I think sometimes it's a lot of thinking about all the ideas in a Western perspective, where you have, like in Norway, an organization goes to the government, give them money, which we call shopping solidarity. They're going to do things according to the norms, and you have countries like mine, which openly is extending the hand to get 50% of their budget, and you have NGOs totally begging every embassy. And of course, we know that geopolitics is in place. We have many interests around, and I won't rule out that one big corporation or country can go through the NGOs to be able to force the agenda, of course, with the terms that, you know, the good forces come from within. To deny that would be maybe not being aware of some other realities. And again, another question is when we talk about regimes, who defines regimes? And who classified them first-class regimes also plays a role. And I think there are politics in this, but what I can agree, R to A is very important to think about because we need them and it should be assistance. If the government cannot even assist the organizations to play the role it can't play, then somebody should give the solidarity hand. But though I think that also, not only in third world countries, I think also the experiences have shown us, even the most developed country like United States, we saw what happened in Ferguson, when everything is kind of systematized and openly people have been denying their basic rights. And then, do we call those, let's say, states or local authorities authoritarians or regimes? No, we don't. And I think if you want to drive a campaign which is fair, we should also not choose sexy words for some others and the other words, you know, which are kind of stamping people, because those people trying to give stamp, they're the ones you want them to come up. And though we know that psychologically, anyone, we say that if somebody is struggling, it's good to give him a place where he can say, yes, I can master something. I can do some, to be able to come out from where we want. And there, I think, will be helping those who need assistance and those who are trying to oppress them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make a couple comments, starting with yours, and then I'll take the previous comment. Thank you. I am somewhat uncomfortable with labeling certain regimes as authoritarian regimes and non-authoritarian regimes, and yet I did it throughout my talk in part for the sake of simplicity. There is, of course, the question of who gets to label whom. My government has been no friend of nonviolent movements in our history, necessarily in many cases, though in some cases it has. And governments are obviously diverse. So parts of the US government, for example, were very critical of the civil rights movement and really tried to label it as externally backed and all the things that we actually hear, sometimes coming from various other governments. Other aspects of my government simply wanted the civil rights movement to go away. And some aspects of my government actually decided, okay, we need to step up and engage the civil rights movement and actually provide some form of protection through the military actually coming and accompanying them in certain cases, though though I would argue, of course, the government never would have done that unless the movement basically forced them to say, look, pay attention or you're going to pay a huge political cost. I mean, the labor movement in the United States was bloody, before that in the 1930s. So my government itself and many other, quote, advanced democracies are quite uncomfortable with their own nonviolent movements that can happen in their own backyard, and no government likes being challenged by a movement against corruption. So in this case, you can see in any context a government can start to shift against a movement. Now, just because government has done that against a movement in this country, does that mean it never has the right or ability to play a supportive role somewhere else? I mean, these are difficult questions, and who gets to label who is a difficult question as well. I'm not sure I have the easiest answer for you on that. When you talked about funding of civil society organizations, I don't know the Burundian context, and I'm sure you're right in terms of the critical role that funding can play and the competition for those funds. On the other hand, I think of, for example, some Palestinian activists who I've talked to who said, all of our best activists leave the movement and get hired by NGOs, and suddenly they're loyal to the NGO and not to the movement. We lose their talent. We get brain drain. We don't get them committed to our movement anymore. So from a movement perspective, funding can be damaging in a lot of ways. And so it's tricky. Like, yes, an organization gets funded. That's critically important. But does that take people out of the community where they might arguably have more impact? And so, again, I don't have an easy yes-no answer, only sort of more problems to consider. On your comment, I think where I'm coming from as a U.S. citizen, of course, and with a long history of the U.S. engaging in all kinds of interventions abroad, many of which were, shall we say, ill-conceived and destructive, is when I talk about government intervention, I'm very cautious. And I think where I'm coming from a different government, I might be able to speak in a different way about the role of governments. That said, the U.S. has done some good things too abroad, and and so it's again, states are not monolithic. There are different actors, especially in a government as large as the U.S., some of which various aspects of the U.S. government are working in direct contradiction to each other in a whole host of countries around the world. And State Department and Pentagon can't agree, and development agencies and others can't agree, and sometimes they don't even know what they're doing because it's so vast. So these are not monolithic, and states can do good things in some places and bad things in other places. And I think in terms of the role of states and how I conceive of them in an R2A kind of setting, one example that has been very inspiring to me has been the example of the Helsinki Accords, signed in 1975 by 35 states, many in Europe and the United States, Canada, and then the Soviet Union. And the Helsinki Accords guaranteed the Soviet Union territorial recognition of the Baltic states. Okay, we recognize you, they're part of the Soviet Union, and recognize that, we won't intervene there. And in exchange, the Soviet Union recognized that, yes, actually, though, people do have a right to self-determination, and that there are some basic rights that are fundamental to people. And after Helsinki signed, you would think, well, the Soviet Union got the realpolitik victory. They got territorial recognition, and they got a guarantee of non-interference. But actually what ended up happening is that accord created political space by having the Soviet Union recognize human rights, and suddenly they had to be held accountable for that, and monitoring organizations could spring up and say, hey, you've signed this, and we're going to start monitoring a little bit. Charter 77 is an example. What later became Human Rights Watch is another example. And so I think states can create enabling environments sometimes simply by bringing issues of human rights to the agenda, not just as a nice ideal, but as actually something that if you understand the process of nonviolent change, when people get rights, they exercise them, and the kind of process that can set forward tends towards peace, stability, and democracy, though not always. Nothing, of course, is 100% guaranteed, but when you look at the alternatives of how to get some kind of transition out of oppression, movements are often, I would argue, in many ways, the most effective. And so creating enabling conditions, not direct support, I think is a key role for states. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I like the comments from the gentleman. What is the civil society? Because I'm Anselm from Burundian diaspora, living in Denmark. The right to assist should be, and there is also this right to interfere on the political side, to interfere in internal affairs, which is discussed on the political side. And then it may mean the same with the right to assist when it is civil society. What I want to underline is that people should be aware that all the people are not on the same level, on the same rhythm. There are countries where civil society is just like on the beginning. And here, when we are here, we think that we are on the same level. The best assistance, I think, should be to give further the knowledge of what should be the responsibility, the role of the civil society. It should be, in my understanding, the best assistance that should be given to some of the countries. You can meet people on the road who are demonstrating, and they have never been aware of non-violence, never been, until they are on the road demonstrating, and those who mobilize them say, you are going to demonstrate against the regime non-violently. And today, they are going to demonstrate. They don't know what is non-violent movement. And at the end of the day, they become maybe nervous, and they begin to maybe to burn the tires in the roads, and it's, maybe it is non-violent. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The best assistance, I think, should be to teach civil society in a lot of countries what is the role of the civil society, and then work, know how to cooperate.
Great.
We have time for one more quick question, and then we'll give Hardy the last word.
I just have two comments. I was thinking about what you said about Norwegian minister saying that international assistance cannot be provided to those who are breaking the law, and I think he could be challenged by saying that Norwegian people, an actual Norwegian state, did provide assistance to those people who were breaking the law decades earlier, and one could probably refer to Polish solidarity movement and anti-apartheid movement. So actually, his words are contradicting the Norwegian people's and state practice in the last 2 decades. Another comment I have about what Scott said regarding whether the R2A can lead to unintended kind of consequences, for example, solidifying security apparatus. From the studies that we did at ICNC and beyond, oftentimes the solidification of security apparatus occur because of the violence on the part of the movement. So in theory, one possible response to the challenge about the positive impact of R2A could be if R2A was to reinforce nonviolent discipline of those who are challenging repressive governments, and if nonviolent discipline is correlated with the defections, that might be one way to go. And then building on that issue of R2A, a kind of argument for the emergence of that norm could be that right now international community is driven by, or the interventions of international community is driven oftentimes by R2A, I mean R2P, responsibility to protect. If such a, and, there are controversies around that, but what R2P oftentimes lead to is actually discouraging, to a certain extent, nonviolent discipline. At least, oftentimes we see in the cases where R2P was exercised was when opposition turned to violence, and then, of course, opposition being much weaker militarily than the state, kind of led to the disproportionate response by the state, violent response that affected civilians, and that when the international community suddenly made calls for R2P. That happened in Libya, that happened in Syria. So we have the existing international norm that somehow, ironically enough, is encouraging the kind of violent challenge to the violent repressor than the non-violent challenge. And perhaps to counterbalance that, the R2A, right to assist, that could encourage non-violent discipline and engaging violent regime through non-violent actions might be a certain way, to balance what the norms are and norms that we have. So R2A vis-a-vis R2P.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll respond briefly to your comment, and then I'll just say a couple things in closing. First of all, thank you. You started, if I heard you, by talking about, well, what I heard was, couldn't R2A be used as a way of furthering agendas, domestic, internationally, of certain states? And yeah, huge issue, right? Huge issue that potentially it could be abused. Of course, already states are doing it and abusing it anyway, even though there's no R2A. I think one way to get around it might be the development of an institution that would be multilateral, at least on the state side, that would sort of have some adjudication and decision making about what was permissible. So you might get 10, 15, 20 member states as part of that, and that would hopefully diffuse the pushing of a particular state agenda under a doctrine of R2A. You also mentioned that you think the education about what civil society's role should be is critical, and I would agree with you completely. In the research that, the strand of research I have focused on for my professional career has been, again, on choice, strategies that work and strategies that don't. What that means is that, from my perspective, a key influencer or factor in the outcomes of grassroots mobilization and movements, whether it's against a local corrupt official, environmental preservation, or something much bigger like democratic progress in a state, skills matter. And knowledge builds skills. And you can make better decisions when you have better information about here's what worked there, here's what worked there, here's what's worked there, here's what the research says. So I think education and information exchange is one of the most critical things that external actors can do. It's what my organization does, not coincidentally. And it's also doesn't have to be direct about, oh, we're giving it to this movement, but not anyone else. No, you post it online, it's free, anyone can have it. You're not supporting any movement. You're simply making the resources available because it's basic scholarship or basic activist manuals or insights produced by activists in other places that is free information. Or, another role that CSOs can play is translating that stuff into other languages. Really critically important. One of the most important things I think that can be done. In other words, I agree with you. I think I want to thank you all for coming. As I said earlier, the whole concept of R2A is one that I kind of avoided for a while. you know, it was a conversation that I felt, well, does this play too much into authoritarian claims that these are externally backed, or does this play too much into this or that? But what I've really discerned over the last 15 years is that there are costs to not talking about it too. There are costs to not naming it. There are costs to sort of letting this backlash continue without a really clear, coherent response, both from a legal side as well as just, if you don't have something to push on, you don't really have an organizing principle around which to say, how do we coordinate action? And my feeling is that the burden of proof should be on states that want to shut down space, want to repress human rights, and want to say, and it's our sovereign right to do it, and you can't intervene. The burden of proof should be on them, clearly. They do not have, there are big pieces of international law that don't support what they're doing. And I think our two-way can start to shift the burden of proof to them, rather than have the burden of proof be on those who want to provide some form of solidarity or assistance, or something as simple as simply giving a translated resource to people in another country. The burden of proof shouldn't be on them to say, oh, or is this okay to intervene? The burden of proof should be on those trying to block that, to say why it's legitimate, why their actions are legitimate. And I see our two-way as a critical part of starting to shift that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.